So you heard Pastor Greaves talk about something that we're going to be doing early on in the new year, and the 14th, discipleship outreach training, looking at our spiritual gifts and how we can be active in ministry. And so I guess as we look towards that and think about that a little bit, let's suppose that we were to divide the people of the church into three main ministry groups. I'm not naive enough to think that everybody in the church is going to be involved in anything that we do, but take the people in the church that are wanting to be active, wanting to do things, and what if we were to organize ourselves into three groups? We wouldn't arbitrarily assign people to a specific group because most people don't like being told what to do. You like to have choice, especially in today's world. So what I'd like to do is just give you a brief description of what this could look like, of what each group would do, so that you can think about that. Maybe you can decide, be thinking in the next couple of weeks what we go through. You could be thinking about, what would I prefer? What group would I best fit with? And maybe you choose to volunteer and join that group. All right? If you're a visitor, you can still think about this. All right? So here are the three options. Think about which one you'd like to be a part of. Ready? Good. Group A, group number one. People in this group would basically give everything they own for our community services and outreach. All right? They would just give away or sell all that they have so that all of those resources could be used to help feed those who are hungry and help those who are poor in our community. And so the people in this group would be personally involved in helping feeding the hungry, helping meeting the needs of the poor. They would be active, hands-on, and we would have to deal with some logistics. We would need to arrange for a place for people to stay, maybe set up some area of cots in the basement of the church. In the summer when school isn't meeting, we could probably set up a kind of a tent city out here in our field. And, if their clothes wear out, we could provide replacements from the community services. Basically, people in Group A would sacrifice deeply to help meet the needs of the less fortunate. Group A, group number one. Group B, group two, whatever you want to call it. Those who join this group will actually leave. They will go to a specific designated area of the world where they will publicly proclaim that they are Christians, followers of Christ. Now, you need to understand some things about what's happening with Group B. You need to realize that in the places where you will go, being a Christian is strictly forbidden. And so once you get there, once you inform people that you are a Christian, you will be sentenced to be burned at the stake for your beliefs. So the way it's working currently is you'll be given 48 hours to renounce Christianity, and it's very simple. If you don't, you burn. That's how it works. So as witnesses for Jesus, people in this group will sacrifice themselves literally as martyrs. Now, that's only two groups so far. And I know what you're probably thinking. You're thinking, I don't even need a third group. The first two groups are so compelling, how can I choose between them? Don't give me another option. But you really need to hear the whole thing. So here's the third ministry group, all right? Just so you don't lock yourself in, keep your options open. Group C. Those who join this third group will be asked to live loving Christian lives. With God's help, these people will allow love to be the guiding principle of their whole Christian experience. And so basically, these people will live out their lives in service to God, but they will do so motivated by Christian love. All right, that's it. That's the three groups. Now, I know that you might need some time to think about that. Some of you will know right away which group you want to be a part of. And some of you will want some time to pray and reflect, maybe do the spiritual gift thing and figure out where you would fit in best. So I'm not going to do this publicly. I'm not going to, say who would like to raise their hands and be a part of Group A or B or C. I'm not going to put you on the spot like that. But I would like you to think about it. Would you like you to think about those three options? And I'd like to ask you a couple questions as you think about that. The first question is this: which of those three groups do you think faces the toughest challenge? Should be the hardest group to be a part of. A, B, or C? And you can think about it. You're welcome to respond too, but just think about it. Which group do you think is most likely to be reported on in the Adventist Review? Who's going to get a feature in Adventist World? Group A, B, or C? And maybe the most important question, which group of the three has the most important mission? Which one is most important? Boy, some of you like Group C. I don't know why. So I'd like you to think about those questions as we consider a well-known chapter in the Bible today. One of those chapters that as Christians we're like, oh yeah, we know what that one says. 1 Corinthians 13. 1 Corinthians 13 is the love chapter. We know that, right? So why don't you, if you've got a Bible, find 1 Corinthians 13, and let's get this going here by reading the first 3 verses. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Verses 1 through 3. And if you find 1 Corinthians 13, just keep it open or keep it locked on that page or that screen or whatever the case is. If you have it memorized, just keep that in your brain. 1 Corinthians 13, 1 to 3, Paul writes, "Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I have become as sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing." So you may notice in verse 3, the 3 ministry group options that I just provided for you. That's where I got them from. And that's the verse that I'd like us to particularly focus on today. But first of all, let's step back first and take a little look at the chapter more generally. Chapter before this, in chapter 12, Paul is talking to the Corinthian Christians about these spiritual gifts and how not everyone in the church has the same gifts as other people in the church have. And he emphasizes to them that these gifts from the Holy Spirit are all needed. The gifts of everybody in the church are needed. Even though some of them appear to be more prominent, some of them appear to be more important, he's saying they're all needed. And notice what he says at the end of chapter 12. Paul wasn't writing in chapters here, but as he kind of finishes that section and prepares to go into what he's going to say in chapter 13, He says in verse 31 of chapter 12, he says, "But earnestly desire the best gifts." And then he says, "And yet I show you a more excellent way." So before he goes on in chapter 14 to discuss some of the gifts he was talking about that they were quite interested in, the gifts of tongues and the gift of prophecy, things like that, before he does that, it's kind of like he takes a pause here. And instead, he focuses the attention to what we find in chapter 13. He takes a pause to talk about love, or what he calls the more excellent way. Now, love is not just another one of those spiritual gifts from the Holy Spirit. True Christian love, where does it come from? Yes, it comes from God. But it is a fruit of the Spirit. It isn't something that's just given to some Christians, like the various spiritual gifts. It is something that is for all Christians, something that must be a part of the character of every single Christian. In fact, it's the first of the fruits of the Spirit that are listed in Galatians 5, 22 and 23, where it lists those fruits, those qualities. The first one there is love. And I don't think that's by accident, because it is the overall most important fruit of the Spirit in a Christian's life. It's really the foundation for all of the other qualities, all of those other fruits that Christians are supposed to have make up their Christian character. And the reason this is here is that he's telling us that it's only in the context of love that the spiritual gifts that he's talking about can function effectively. He's saying before we get too far on the spiritual gift thing, let's stop and remember that it's the realm of love in which this operates. So Paul takes some time here in his letter to the Corinthians to focus their thinking on the preeminence of love, lest they get too caught up in thinking about what gifts they have and how important they are, especially in comparison to the other people in the church. Paul reminds them that love is the most important thing. Without love, he says they're just wasting their time, and frankly, they're just wasting their gifts. So in the first two verses of 1 Corinthians 13, Paul refers to some of the gifts that he had been mentioning in chapter 12. He talks about gifts like tongues and prophecy and wisdom and knowledge and faith. And he clearly states that without love, the possession of these gifts is useless. As great as it may be to have and be able to use these gifts, he's saying one who has them without love is nothing. It's a pretty strong statement. And you look a little further down, go down to verse 8 of chapter 13 and look at what Paul says. He said, love never fails, but whether there are prophecies, they will fail. Whether there are tongues, they will cease. Whether there is knowledge, it will vanish away. So Paul here is explaining to them that many of these spiritual gifts will cease to be of importance when Jesus comes back and this world ends. You know, if you're a great prophet, guess what? In heaven, you got to find something else to do because your job is done. Gifts like prophecy, tongues, knowledge, they're not going to be needed anymore. Once Jesus comes, we don't need the gift of prophecy. We're there with God. We can know his will directly. We don't need a prophet. Our future will be secure. We will be able to communicate with him and with one another face to face. We don't need a gift of tongues to help us understand different languages. We don't need the gift of knowledge then. The Lord is our teacher. We don't need someone with the gift of knowledge to help us figure it out. Those gifts aren't needed anymore. They're gifts that serve a useful purpose now because they help build up the body of Christ here on earth as we wait for the Lord's return. But once he comes, they're done. Their usefulness is finished. So he's giving them some perspective and helping them remember that it was important to keep things in a proper perspective. They needed to be reminded that love was the most important thing, not some of these spiritual gifts that they prized so much. Some of these gifts that they tended to have a tendency to focus their attention so much on. He's saying, don't get off track here. Many of these gifts are temporary, earthly things, but he's reminding them that love is an eternal, universal thing. Look at what he says in verse 13 when we get to the end of this chapter before he continues on talking about some of the specific gifts. As he concludes this section on love in verse 13, he says, "And now abide faith, hope, love, these three, but the greatest of these is love." These are the things that go on. These are the things that will be a part of God's people for all of eternity. If you don't like these things, eternity looks grim because these things are going to continue. Paul clearly states here that the greatest of even these eternal things, like faith and hope, the greatest even of them is still love. Love is the most important thing now, the most important thing forever. But just how important is love? I know, you're like, oh, we know that. We've heard that a million times. Yeah, but sometimes we need to hear it again. How important is love? Well, let's go back now and look at the verse I want to focus on most, and that is verse 3 of 1 Corinthians 13. Because I think sometimes, we've read these chapters so many times, and we almost kind of just know them, and we can read them with our brain on autopilot, or no pilot, and we maybe miss what it says, but look at what Paul says in verse 3. I mean, it's almost like Paul gets kind of crazy here. Or maybe crazy isn't good, but he goes to the extreme. Like, you have to say, does he maybe carry this a little bit too far? I mean, look at what he says. "And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor," that's extreme. "And though I give my body to be burned," that's pretty extreme. "But have not love, it profits me nothing." Profits me nothing. So sure, it makes sense that some of the spiritual gifts and abilities that Paul mentions in the first two verses, it makes sense that they're not more important than love. Of course not. Something like knowledge or prophecy can't replace love. It can't be a substitute for it. You don't say, "Oh, son, I love you." "Oh, actually, I don't love you. I have a prophecy for you." You can't replace love with some of those things. But isn't Paul overstating it a little bit here in verse 3? I mean, hasn't he gone a little bit too far? I mean, what he's describing, isn't that love in action? Isn't it? What about what it says in James 1:27? Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress. Isn't that kind of similar to feeding the poor? Isn't that the same kind of idea? And then even closer to the point, we have that story in the Bible of the rich young ruler who asked Jesus about eternal life. It's recorded in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew chapter 19, Mark chapter 10, Luke chapter 18. And you remember the story after the young man affirmed that he had been observing the commandments? Jesus told him to go and sell whatever he had and give it to the poor, and then he was to follow Christ. But Paul claims that if a person gives all his goods to feed the poor without love, he gains nothing. So was Paul contradicting Jesus here? Had Paul not read that story? Was he contradicting Christ? I'd say no. Because if we look at that story of Jesus and the rich young ruler, I think we find that the context of love is there. In fact, it's all through that story. It's interesting that Jesus first referred to the commandments. And remember in John 14:15, Jesus said to us that if we love him, we'll keep his commandments. So the idea of love is already inherent in that. When Jesus is talking about commandments, Jesus is talking in the realm of love. And then after the man replies that he has been keeping the commandments, Mark 10:21 says, then Jesus, looking at him, loved him. There's love all through that story. It's not a contradiction. Jesus knew that the man loved his wealth more than anything else, and he knew that the man would not be able to do what Jesus said if he was not willing to make the choice to make love for God and love for others a priority above the things that he loved. And Paul is really agreeing with that. Paul is saying that even if even we could do that, what Jesus told that man to do, sell all that you have and give to the poor. How many of you have done that? Maybe somebody has. I haven't. I've never done that. But he said, even if you did that, it will be of no profit to you if you aren't motivated by love. So Paul is simply clarifying the necessary motive in this thing. Such an action, even one so extreme as selling all that you have to feed the poor, won't store up any treasure in heaven if you don't do it for the right reason. Which raises the question, can good deeds be done for wrong reasons? If something is good, is it good no matter what? Or can you do good but for wrong or maybe for selfish rather than loving reasons? Can you do good but in a bad way? There's an illustration I once read that helps answer and clarify that question for me. I think it illustrates it well. And it's from, I don't even know how long ago, but sometime in the past. It's pretty vague. Apparently there were some vandals who cut down 6 royal palm trees along Flagler Street in Miami, Florida. So they had these nice palm trees lined up, all very nice, and some people, I guess at night, came and cut them down for some reason. And so now they had a problem because they liked those palm trees. So the Dade County authorities, said, oh my goodness, our palm trees have been cut down. It would be nice to replace them, but we don't know if we can replace them because the budget is tight, and these aren't just regular trees. You just get another tree and put it there. These are very expensive, hard to get trees. And so they were kind of in a quandary, but then something interesting happened. The interesting part of the story, someone stepped forward and donated 6 brand new trees, or not brand new trees, because you don't want brand new trees, but 6 flourishing trees, and not only donated the trees, but actually donated the cost and arranged to have the new trees planted in place to replace the old trees. Isn't that nice? Yes, that was very nice. But the original trees were about 15 feet tall. And just a little ways behind them, above the tops of the trees, there happened to be a large billboard that advertised Fly Delta, for Delta Airlines. That just happened to be where a billboard was with these trees. The interesting thing is, when the donors donated these new trees and had them installed, what they found out was the new trees were bigger. Instead of 15 feet tall, they were 35 feet tall. So can you imagine what that did to the sign? It did nothing to the sign. But it made it so that nobody could see the sign. Those trees completely blocked the sign. And then it came out who the donors of these new trees were, who the kind, generous donors who had not only donated the trees, but arranged for them to be planted. It was an organization called Eastern Airlines. True, competitor. And it makes you wonder who cut down the trees in the first place. Can you do good for a bad reason, with a bad motive? See, motive can make a huge difference. And in fact, it can make a huge difference even with these extreme examples that Paul talks about in verse 3. To give all of your goods to feed the poor, to go down in flames as a martyr. Let's face it, at first thought, stuff like that seems like pretty selfless, pretty sacrificial act, right? You're not going to do that lightly. You have to wonder, what more could a person possibly do? How could your motives be bad? And yet even actions as extreme as these, I think Paul is reminding us, even things like that can be motivated by selfishness rather than by love. And it's interesting that some of the ancient manuscripts of the Bible read a little bit differently for verse 3. For some of them, the ancient copies, some of them say, instead of saying, and though I give my body to be burned, some of them say, and though I give my body so I may boast. The scholars will debate for the end of time which should be the right reading. And many versions of your Bible, if you have any marginal notes, it will have that marginal reading as an option in there. But if nothing else, I think that marginal reading hints at the selfish motives behind the actions that Paul is describing in this verse. And maybe it's not just talking about giving one's body, but maybe it's also talking about giving all you have to feed the poor. It's like Paul is saying, you can even do great things like that, but you're doing it for the wrong reason. It's selfish. Maybe for your own honor, your own glory, to look good, maybe to make a point or something. You see, if a person gives all he has to help out the needy because of his love for God and because of his love for those he helps, that is wonderful. That is incredible. That's God ordained. That's something where that person will be richly blessed and those he helps will be richly blessed. And if a person stands up for Christ, even if it means death because she loves her Lord, that is wonderful. That provides a powerful, incredible testimony of faith. A wonderful witness. But if those actions are done for reasons other than love, then according to what we're reading here, they lose their value completely. They're not of a little bit of value, they're just useless. And Jesus spoke very clearly about this in Matthew 6, 1-4. He said that those who do charitable deeds so that they will be praised by others have their reward. That's it. That's all they get. They should not expect any reward from God, for in God's eyes their actions are of no value. I gave $90,000 to church budget. I didn't. I'm just an example. In God's eyes, if that's not done for the right reason, thanks, but no thanks. No value. You know what? I admire those who give up basically everything to serve those in need. Have you ever known? I've known some people that they'll go without almost anything as long as someone else can be helped. I admire those people. I remember Lloyd Cooley in my very first church. Someone would give him a new pair of mittens and he would go get out his old holy ones, holy as in lots of holes in them, and give the new ones to someone else. You couldn't give the guy anything because he'd give it to someone else who was in more need. Admire him. I admire those who forego the usual comforts of our society to give of themselves sacrificially, often far removed from their relatives and homes. I admire the people you read about in Adventist Frontier Missions magazine. It's people who really do sell pretty well all that they have and go off to some culture that's foreign to them and a language that's foreign to them and separated from family and all their support system and try to share the gospel message. You got to admire that. Admire people like Mother Teresa, devoting her life to help the lepers and those that are poor and disadvantaged. And I have to admire those who are willing to die for their faith, don't you? That's pretty serious. Think about Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego being thrown into Nebuchadnezzar's fiery furnace that we read about in Daniel 3. How can you not admire those guys? Go ahead, throw us in the flames. Man, Think about the early Christians in the time of the Roman Emperor Nero who were set on fire to light up the Colosseum. Let's just gather up a few Christians and light them up, and that'll be kind of neat to watch them burn. Man, I got to admire them. Think of the reformers. Think of the countless other Christians who right up to today have burned at the stake, or they're given their lives as martyrs in so many horrendous and gruesome ways just because they chose to remain true to their convictions. I see that and I'm like, wow, what a picture of faith. You have to admire their dedication and their courage and their faith. And yet, even in matters like that, we're reminded that motive is everything. So two people could do the same thing, even extreme things like what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 3, and on the outside, they appear the same. Giving their lives, giving everything, sacrifice. To human eyes, their actions appear equally admirable, but God is different. God sees on the inside. He sees the motive. He sees the hearts. He sees the minds. He sees what's behind it. He sees the presence or the absence of true love. And so those who may appear the same on the outside to me, and I say, wow, what an example of faith. God may see those two people very differently because he knows why they're doing what they're doing. Because there is no substitute for love. There is no act, there's no sacrifice, there's no offering, no matter how great or extreme, that can make up for a lack of genuine love. Because love is simply the most important thing. Love is the context and the foundation for all Christian experience. Everything Christians do, every action, every activity has to have that foundation. Love is so central because as 1 John 4:8 says, God is love. We're going to talk about spiritual gifts. We're going to think again about how do we live as disciples for Christ. And we forget this point. We get all focused on what we're doing and our plans and initiatives and theories and gifts. And we forget this. We're wasting time. We're spending some energy, but we're probably wasting time and money. You see, when our names come up in the judgment before God, when God considers whether we want to spend eternity with him or not, he would like to spend eternity with us. But when he considers whether we want to spend eternity with him, he does not ask us if we can graph out Daniel's 2300-day prophecy and show exactly when the antitypical Day of Atonement starts. That should be good news to many of you. But you should know that. He doesn't ask if we can explain the intricacies of the theological debate on the nature of Christ. Thank God. Right? You're like, there's a debate? You know what? He doesn't even ask us, especially for us old-time Adventists, he doesn't ask us how many hours we've pounded the streets in gathering, or collecting money for ADRA, or serving a soup kitchen. What he wants to know, what I understand what he looks at, ultimately what he asks us is this. He asks you and me, how have you loved? How have you loved? And man, I can get caught up doing so much stuff and I forget that that's what really matters. Love is the most important thing. It doesn't matter how many committees you have chaired. It doesn't matter how much you've donated to the church improvement fund. It doesn't matter how many times you've cleaned the church, whatchamacallit, and nobody ever notices and it's in the background and you never get recognition in the bulletin or from the pulpit or from the pastors or anybody else. It doesn't matter what else you've done if you don't have love. If you've lost Christian love, this is telling us you've lost it all. If you don't have love, you may as well forget doing anything else because you've lost the most important thing. You've lost the necessary element. And that's not to say that nothing else is important. Of course it is. It's just we got to remember that love is most important. Realize that genuine Christian love will motivate to action. It will use God's gifts. It will serve. It will give. Love cannot just sit there in indifferent apathy. Oh, I'm pretty comfortable. Love can't do that. Love gets busy. Love's got to be active. But love is most important. So what is this love? Because love is a fairly vague term in our language, right? Love means so many things. I love my wife. I love ice cream. Love is pretty broad. The love we're talking about is agape love. You've heard that. Agape being one of the Greek words for love. The word that the Bible uses to refer to genuine Christian love. It's that love that's based on principle. It's not merely based on feelings and emotions. It's a love that loves even when you don't feel like it. Not a selfish love. It's a love that's centered on others. It's not based on what can I get from the love. It's based on what can others get from the love. It's the love that God has for us. It's the love that we as Christians are supposed to have not only for each other, it's the love we're supposed to have for everybody. That's pretty comprehensive. And perhaps we can see a bit of an example of this type of love in a little story from a long time ago. A little news article one time reported in the New York Times. And the little article said that it reported that a wall of a New York City public library had been defaced. So what happened? Apparently an energetic little boy took some chalk and he took it upon himself to draw this great big heart on the side of the library building. It's graffiti. It's probably a crime. But inside the masterpiece, he simply wrote, "Billy Mayer loves everybody." That's agape love. Not committing acts of vandalism and graffiti, but loving everybody. Billy Mayer loves everybody. That's what God asks us to do. Love everybody. That's what agape love is about. And so I came across this little poem that I think describes very well this type of love. It's called The Forever Kind of Love. And it just lists the author as Connie. So I don't know who Connie is or where she comes from or what her last name is, but I think she did a good job of expressing love in this poem. Kind of like a prayer. And it goes like this. Lord, grant us the forever kind that sees the faults but doesn't mind. The kind that says, I love you still, if not by feelings, then by will. The kind that's like your own love, Lord, that seeks to serve, not earn reward. The kind that sees the best in each, that seeks to pray for, not to preach. A love-made choice, always to stay, to be there till our dying day. And when death comes to break earth's spell, Lord, may you tell us you loved well. That's what we want to hear, right? And if you really want to know what that love is like, we're not going to take the time to look at it right now, but you need look no further than verses 4 to 7 of this chapter in 1 Corinthians 13. Paul describes love so beautifully, I don't think it could be done better. And yet we may wonder, how could we ever really have such a love? Well, I would say that we first have to realize that such a love can only come from God. He's the only source of this love. And that means the only way we get such a love is we receive it as a gift from Him. And that means that if it's an important gift from Him, if it really is so important, then that means that we should ask God for it in prayer. It means that we should be intentional to read about it and how it works in the Bible. We should spend some time thinking and meditating about its qualities and importance. And we should think about how we can show it more, and then we should try showing it more. You know, some people are like, well, I don't know, if it doesn't come natural, it probably shouldn't do it. No, it doesn't come natural. You're a sinner. So am I. But it's worth practicing being genuinely loving. That's how we get better at it. That means trying to intentionally deal with your day-to-day life from the perspective of love. Man, I could really improve on that a lot. As we start a new year, by God's grace, I hope I can do that better. It really is the most important thing, and if that's the case, then it's worth wanting, and it's worth the effort it requires to develop it. So my friends, in case you missed it, what is the most important thing? Love is the most important thing. And if the gospel had to be summed up in just one word, if you only had one word to say for the gospel, is there a better word you could say than love? That's why I like this simple little chorus that I thought everybody knew.